My original text started out with a cheery greeting, but when I heard about the potential Iranian involvement in the conflict between Israel and Gaza, I need to express my concern for how I imagine this might be affecting the Iranian people. My first visit there was in 2003, and it was just at a time when there was actually a very high possibility of an Israeli airstrike, but using American weaponry on the nuclear plants in Iran, and very close to Tehran, and even closer, I think, to Qom. And so I, in fear for myself, having to evacuate, I brought along a lot of extra cash in case it was hard to get an earlier plane flight out. So I have experienced anxiety concerning the atrocities that my government might inflict, and I want to apologize. Another thing, before I get down to business, I've been so impressed by the philosophers I've met in Iran. So when question time comes, I invite not only questions, but also discussion and corrections from the Iranian scholars in the audience. This might not be a polite thing to do under some circumstances, but because this is a class, I certainly don't want to be teaching anything that's not correct. So now, down to business. Here's my plan for this presentation. My topic is the modern concept of the laws of nature, with special emphasis on the uniformity of nature, because there was a, I'm nervous, sorry. My topic is the modern concept of the laws of nature, with special emphasis on the divine origin. However, I'll begin with the medieval approach to the uniformity of nature, because there was a conversation of sorts, that is, an exchange of writings among Islamic and Western Christian scholars at that time. And it's mostly thanks to your ancestors that Europeans were able to access writings of Aristotle that had been lost for centuries. Muslim philosophers also incorporated Aristotelianism into their own works and had a great impact on philosophers and theologians in Europe. A primary example is the towering figure of the Middle Ages, Thomas Aquinas, of the 13th century. He was influenced by Ibn Sina of the 11th century and Ibn Rushd. I hope I pronounced that correctly. Everyone I've heard here uses the crazy Latinized versions. So please feel free to correct me during the discussion time. Most of you probably already know what I've said so far. Something that might be new to you is what happened afterwards in the West, so that Aristotelianism came to be rejected. And this, of course, was what required early modern scholars to find an entirely new way to account for regularities in nature. The concept of the laws of nature was created for this purpose, largely beginning in the 17th century. I had to read a great deal myself to find the reasons for rejecting Aristotelianism. I present a short account in section 2. In section 3, I describe some of the development of the concept of laws, beginning with René Descartes. Tyler Hildebrand will present a complementary account before my next presentation on Tuesday. Finally, some scholars claim that beginning around 1950, the concept of the laws has begun to be replaced. I will provide a few examples in my second presentation. That lecture, just after Tyler's, I hope will be complementary to his. While he will argue just he will argue that just as Isaac Newton and other Christian natural philosophers saw their scientific contributions as arguments for God's existence, I'll argue in contrast, and this is contrary to the title that I sent in earlier, the concept of God gradually ceased to be needed in light of the natural functioning of the laws. I'll recount some familiar roles that Christian religion played in the furtherance of atheism, along with a few of my own speculations. So, Section 2, Reasons for the Demise of Aristotelianism. I believe that one way to begin an account of a new modern explanation of regularities is to distinguish events before and after the Protestant Reformation. The Reformation began in 1517 when Martin Luther posted 95 complaints about the church on the door of the Castle Church in Wittenberg, now part of Germany. These theses were in many cases theological, but they were also concerned with the wasting of money and the general disorder of church leadership in Rome. Although he didn't intend to start a revolt, he was excommunicated. That is, he lost his membership in the church in 1521. After that, a number of other scholars and pastors followed the Lutherans in search of reform. John Calvin in Geneva was the most influential, breaking from Catholicism and writing a strikingly new theology by 1535. His followers were known as members of Reformed churches. Even before that, however, a pastor in Zurich by the name of Huldrych Zwingli set out to reform his own congregation in the 1520s, but he was hindered in his reforms by the city government. In response to this, a small number of church members left to form their own movement, which became known as the Radical Reformation. One of their distinctives was that they specifically rejected the still nearly universal church-state unions that had been in effect for centuries. Now, I do recognize that church-state relations might be a bit of a touchy topic in Iran. However, because of the continuing retention of church-state unions, the rejection of Aristotelianism was driven both theologically and politically. I believe it was largely political authorities, or at least I hope so, not church leaders who carried out the tremendous number of tortures and executions during the Reformation period. Already before the Reformation, there had been scholarly dissension regarding the use of Aristotelian philosophy in theology. One reason was that Thomas's very intelligent system had by then degenerated to what is now simply called scholasticism. But after the Reformation, there was much more widespread rejection of it, both because of the association of Thomism with Catholicism and because of objections to pagan influences in theology. Of course, Aristotle's views had needed to be changed in a number of ways in order to be incorporated into Christian theology. An important issue was that for Aristotle, the form was the immanent essence that made humans humans. It was also called the individual soul. For Aristotle, when the body dies and disintegrates, the soul ceases to be. Thomas had what many scholars believe was a somewhat unintelligible argument to the effect that when the body dies and disintegrates, the highest rational faculties were immortal. Nonetheless, this partial soul required resurrection of the body to recreate the entire person. One of the things I love about Iranian philosophy is that you actually place a lot more emphasis on the resurrection than Christians do. So much appreciated. Many scholars believe that Thomas's position was inadequate for various reasons. Some in Paris and northern Italy, for example, held to an Averroist view of the soul and rejected the Thomas synthesis. Now, I was checking facts in one of two major print encyclopedias of philosophy. The author of the article on Averroism says that as a designation applicable to a tradition of philosophizing, Averroism cannot be used in any account of Arabic thought after the death of Averroes. But the author doesn't make the distinction between Arabs and Persians. So I hope someone will tell me after the lecture's over whether it's true that Averroism lasted longer in Paris than it did in Persia. Controversies of this sort lasted up to and during the birth of modern science. Because most reformers' agenda included elimination of Aristotelianism, it's not surprising that most of the well-known participants in natural philosophy in the 17th century were Protestants of one sort or another. And also, due to the division of Europe into Catholic, Reformed, and Lutheran territories, national pride had some influences regarding who was taken to be responsible for major developments. The most important exception to these histories, which have turned out to be largely of Protestant accomplishments, is René Descartes, who is often credited with beginning the new modern age. Although persecuted by the Church, he maintained his allegiance to Catholicism throughout his short life. Nonetheless, he was strongly opposed to the Aristotelian or scholastic aspects of medieval thought. Descartes is regularly called the father of modern philosophy, but he may also be thought of as the father of modern science. So I now turn to section 3, describing a small part of the history of the origin and development of the concept of the laws of nature. There was wide agreement among early natural philosophers that just as God had provided laws for humans through revelation, analogously, in the mind of God, there must be laws governing the natural world. Contemporary author Mehdi Golshani reminds us that the founders of modern science, such as Descartes, Galileo, and Newton, were sincere believers in God, and they considered scientific activity as an act of worship. One of the most striking characteristics of the early modern laws was their mathematical formulations. Both Copernicus and Galileo had needed complex mathematics to plot the orbits of the planets, and Galileo needed optical calculations to justify trusting the data that could be found by observations through a telescope. The three sciences that were first described as law-governed were, in fact, optics, astronomy, and the laws of motion. So I turn now to Descartes, who in his Principles of Philosophy, published in 1644, focuses specifically on divinely imposed laws of motion. Next, I'll take up Robert Boyle's providential emphasis on the essentially law-governed character of the natural world. Descartes was born in France in 1596. He was of a noble family and studied at the famous Jesuit school La Flèche. However, he was disappointed with the education he had received in that he found none of his coursework to provide certain knowledge. He then went to Bavaria, where he served in the military. It's said that he had dreams which he interpreted to be telling him that he had a divine calling to create a unified worldview based in mathematics. He was, in fact, quite interested in and good at math, and is credited with invention of analytic geometry. This is what allows for solving geometric problems algebraically and vice versa. In his philosophy, as we now divide up the disciplines, Descartes is well known for the sharp distinctions he drew between two radically different types of substance: the corporeal substances and thinking substances. He wrote that extension is the essence of corporeal substance. However, the geometrical concept of a material body would only account for a static world. Therefore, an account of the natural world must incorporate motion, and he must therefore inquire into its origin. It is at this point that Descartes introduces God and divine agency. God is the first cause of motion in the world. Now, doesn't this sound like the Aristotelianism that he was supposedly rejecting? Moreover, he writes, God conserves an equal quantity of motion. And here we find a direct reference to the divinely instituted laws of nature. He writes that God preserves every part of matter with the same laws with which he made them observe at their creation. Descartes' three laws are, first, that bodies at rest or in motion stay in that state unless changed by the agency of some other body. Second, everything in motion continues to move in a straight line, and this, he believes, is somehow due to the fact that God is immovable. The third is more complicated, but I'll summarize it by saying that for a second body to change the directionality of a body in motion, it must have more force than the first. Otherwise, the first moves the second along with it. And Descartes again attributes this law to divine origin, God's immutability. However, although he wanted his system to be entirely deductive, he recognized the need for empirical investigation, because without material objects, there would be nothing for the human understanding to work on. Permit me to insert an aside here. Descartes and Sadra were nearly contemporaries, and it's a shame they didn't have the advantages of email. A very quick review of Sadra's philosophy lists a few features of his thought that are close to or perhaps even identical with Descartes'. First, among his many accomplishments, he's credited with the harmonizing of religion with philosophy. Second, he attributes knowledge to illumination. And third, he rejected the notion of essences. The parallels I noticed are, first, Descartes' system was surely a harmonization of his natural philosophy with theology. Second, he accepts as premises of his arguments only ideas in his mind that he perceived to be clear and distinct. And I'm wondering, might this be called illumination? And third, he also surely rejected anything like Aristotelian essences. Now, from among the numerous Christian natural philosophers of the 17th century and early 18th, I select Robert Boyle, living from 1627 to 1692. Like Descartes, he came from a noble and wealthy English family, but he was born in Ireland. He only had 4 years of formal schooling at Eton, so the rest of his quite varied knowledge came from reading. He read Calvin's theology and wrote treatises on both theology and morality. In contrast to Descartes, who believed that he was best able to think in solitude, Boyle promoted collegiality. He devised experiments in chemistry and created the distinctive genre of the lab report, including precisely written descriptions of his experimental methods, so that others could duplicate or make variations on his own procedures. Historian of science Stephen Gaukroger is apparently the one who first coined the term providential deism, which has been widely used since. Note that this is not the deism that was to come later, when stripped of all revealed aspects of Christian theology. The historical value of providential deism is that it explains the transition from the concept of God as an agent interacting with humans and intervening in human history, to that of a God who is architect of a universe operating by means of unchanging laws. This new view of God's relation to the universe provided for a transition to a legal mechanical world picture, which has been central to understanding of science for centuries. It both motivated scientific investigation and was in turn confirmed by the very obvious success of such science. The legal mechanical tradition had its roots in late medieval voluntarist conceptions of God. Voluntarism, an emphasis on God's omnipotent will, is frequently cited as one of the presuppositions of the rise of modern science. That is, if God's ordering of creation is not constrained by some rational principles of order which humans might be able to apprehend, then the only way to know how the world is in fact ordered is to study it in detail. Boyle contributed significantly to this view of natural order, which featured law, design, and mechanical arrangements. As I said at the beginning of my account of the developing idea of the laws, Boyle too based his views on analogy to God's laws in the Old Testament. So Boyle emphasized that these laws were God's ongoing providence. Here's where we find Gaukroger's and a number of other historians' term providential deism so useful. Boyle was thoroughly Christian in his theology, believing in God's revelation in Christ and even in the resurrection. In contrast to the later deists' absentee God, Boyle argued for the continued dependence of creation on God. And it was, as with Descartes, for theological reasons that Boyle emphasized both the existence and inviolability of the laws. The laws served as an intermediary between a thoroughly transcendent God and his creation. The inviolability of the laws was based on God's omniscience. Boyle wrote that the omniscient author of things, who in his vast and boundless understanding comprehended at once the whole system of his works and every part of it, did not mainly intend the welfare of such and such particular creatures, but subordinated his care of their preservation and welfare to his care of maintaining the universal system and primitive scheme or contrivance of his works, and especially those Catholic rules of motion and other grand laws which he had first established." End quote. So Boyle's so-called physico-theology was typical in his day of the legal mechanical tradition that came to define science for approximately 3 centuries. This concept of nature was seen by some as a threat to religion. For example, by philosopher Immanuel Kant, particularly in the wake of Newton's successes. However, it was easily turned into an apologetic. Philosopher Wallace Matson, whom I knew to have a wry sense of humor, writes that, quote, "In previous ages, the occurrence of miracles had provided proof of the existence, power, intelligence, and goodness of God. Now, the non-existence of exceptions to the order of nature proved the existence, power, intelligence, and goodness of God." Now, up to this point, I believe I've given a fairly representative historical account of Boyle's thought, but there's one historian of religion and science, Eugene Claren, who adds what I find to be an interesting but somewhat unusual contribution to the history of Boyle's thinking. Claren claimed that at the time he was writing, in 1977, there was a movement that was, for historians, a relatively new topic of study, the spiritualist movement. This tradition was flourishing in England during Boyle's lifetime, and he believes it to be essential for understanding Boyle's work. He makes the broader statement that what came to be known as natural science is the result of the triumph of the legal mechanical world picture, not only of the Aristotelian Thomist system, but also over this equally powerful spiritualist alternative. Boyle, in particular, was equally opposed to this worldview as he was to the medieval synthesis. Claren describes the spiritualism of the 17th century as a relatively amorphous yet influential cluster of ideas, practices, and ideals. Its sources include varieties of Renaissance Platonism, mystical strains in Catholic, Protestant, and Jewish thought, alchemy, and not least, the alleged writings of Hermes Trismegistus. During this time in England, magic and alchemy thrived as never before. The spiritualist view of divine action is far from the Protestantism of England in those days. However, it would take a specialist in the frequently changing official religions of England at the time to sort out exactly what Boyle was likely to have believed. Therefore, I'll simply have to trust Claren as an expert in the history of that day. However, other somewhat earlier historians who mention spiritualism make the now well-recognized mistake of confusing this spiritualism with what was known in Reformation days as the so-called spiritualizers. And these, in turn, were often erroneously confused with the radical reformers of the 16th century, whom I mentioned earlier. For the spiritualists of the mid-17th century, quote, all created entities are forms of divine spirit, unquote. God is in all cases the total cause of everything that happens, and God perpetually creates all things ex nihilo. All order and motion in nature are attributed directly to God. Thus, knowledge of the world comes not so much from empirical observation as from inspiration. Boyle found the spiritualist's account of divine action repugnant. He was especially opposed to the spiritualists' diffusions of God in the world. I insert a note at this point. It seems to me that historical textbooks often try to clean up the figures they describe in order to fit contemporary standards. For example, how many students of science know that Newton was a devoted alchemist, or that Galileo intentionally provoked Pope Urban VIII, earlier known as Maffeo Barberini? Barberini was actually a friend of Galileo's with a keen interest in science. I have up to this point given two biographically focused accounts of early modern developments, so I will attempt now to provide a more conceptual overview of the many developments. There are some philosophers who believe that their subject treats perennial problems such as concepts of truth, justice, free will. Others of us believe that over the course of history, cultural and other factors actually create new problems, but they have enough of what Ludwig Wittgenstein calls family resemblances to be considered continuations of an earlier trajectory of thought. So, for instance, I wrote an article for, here it is, commercial break. I wrote an article on free will for the Journal of Philosophical Theological Research edited by a long-distance email friend of mine, Zara Kazei, in Qom. End of commercial break. In writing that article, I found that with some difficulty, it was possible to find a somewhat reliable date for when the concept of the will came into existence. However, it was easy to give a precise late modern date when philosopher Gilbert Ryle parodied the concept of the will so effectively that it essentially lost its referent and is only repeated out of respect for earlier accounts of intellectual faculties. So I side with historian Frans van Lunteren, professor of history of science in the Netherlands, who says explicitly that he is interested in a, quote, conceptual history of the term laws of nature, a biography of specific laws, end quote. I've already presented in my accounts of Descartes and Boyle several important alterations. The first, and a very important one, was one of these was the notion that a law of nature needed to be expressible mathematically, but Boyle's work, in it we have seen the expansion of the range of sciences that were taken to count as law-governed. That is the extension from the trio of optics, astronomy, and laws of physics to the new science of chemistry. There was the important shift already in Boyle's work from Descartes' belief that the laws of motion could somehow be deduced from the attributes of God to a nonetheless theologically based expectation that the laws needed to be discovered empirically. That is, voluntarism in theology implied that God's ordering of nature could not be subject to any higher principle, potentially determining God's free choices. Therefore, scientists needed to observe how the natural processes were in fact ordered. Van Lunteren notes also that the search for laws came increasingly to be seen as the central goal of science. All of this brings to mind for me the recent search for a single theory of everything, under which all other physical laws could be unified. And this search, even the idea of its possibility, brings to mind Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, who was born in Leipzig in 1646. One way of stating Leibniz's famous claim that this is the best of all possible worlds is that it is the one in which the greatest number of phenomena can be derived from the fewest possible number of hypotheses or laws. So just as the trajectories of a vast number of objects can be derived using one simple law of gravitation, Leibniz would have been delighted if the law of gravitation itself could be derived from a single theory of everything. And this, in fact, is one of the laws that a TOE is hoped to explain. Another hugely important feature of the laws is their association with causal explanation. On one hand, Boyle himself questioned this assumption. Van Lunteren writes that at times, Boyle questioned whether brute matter could really obey laws. Could a so-called law of nature really be more than a mere metaphor that expressed how God invariably acted in the world? And Scottish philosopher Thomas Reid, 100 years later, also noted that true agency required intelligence and will. He therefore classified the study of efficient causation as part of natural theology rather than natural philosophy. On the other hand, despite these objections spanning at least a century at the beginning, and certainly well represented in our own day, the association of explanation by means of scientific laws with causal explanation has continued well into the 20th century. A particularly clear example is found in the writings of the late philosopher of science, Carl Hempel. He calls his account of scientific method hypothetico-deductive. Scientists begin with a collection of related observations. Then a hypothesis needs to be invented, which, if true, deductively implies the observation statements. This requires the addition of auxiliary premises, including descriptions of initial conditions and so forth. The hypothesis, a scientific generalization or law, then needs to be tested, because with enough imagination, a variety of such hypotheses could be invented. This requires deduction of additional consequences. If, for the law in question, these predicted consequences are borne out by new observation or by experiment, the law is confirmed. Importantly for this discussion, it can be called a scientific explanation of these initial and consequent facts. Hempel visited the philosophy department at the University of California, Berkeley, twice while I was there in 1975 and 77. This was just at the time of what we consider to have been a true revolution in the philosophy of science from the neo-positivist tradition to which Hempel belonged, which originated approximately in the 1930s and replaced by Thomas Kuhn, Paul Feyerabend, and others, often called the historicists. I was privileged to be Hempel's teaching assistant. It is interesting that in his undergraduate classes, Hempel taught the hypothetico-deductive method, but in doctoral seminars, he graciously described and acknowledged the cogency of the criticisms that the historicists were raising against him and his generation of philosophers of science. Another important issue in the historically developing concept of the laws, which intersects with the question of their causal efficacy, is the issue of necessity versus contingency. My new friend by correspondence, Tyler Hildebrand's first presentation on Tuesday is titled An Introduction to the Metaphysics of Laws of Nature. He writes it as abstract that he intends to place special emphasis on the general distinction between Humeanism, which treats the laws as merely descriptive, versus non-Humeanism, according to which laws actually govern events in nature. I'm very much looking forward to what I'll learn from this. However, I hope I'll not be duplicating his project here if I add a note on what appeared to me to be an interesting ambiguity in Hume's overlapping agendas. When studying philosophy, even at the graduate level, we in the US at least, only encounter the contingent Hume. But another of his projects was his huge History of England from the invasion of Julius Caesar to the Revolution of 1688, published over the years from 1754 to 1762. I've read a considerable amount of secondary literature on the history in the hope of pinning down a fuzzy idea I had that went something like this. Hume may very well write that there's no necessary connection between, say, A and B. It's only by means of our experience of B's regularly following A's that our minds become determined to pass from one to the other. But in order to refute the necessary condition between all A's and B's, doesn't Hume have to invoke some necessary laws of human psychology? After reading a number of conflicting accounts in secondary literature, I came to the conclusion that these conflicts were due to a distinction that my old friend Wally Mattson employs in his History of Philosophy between inside out and outside in epistemologies. Jeffrey Stout makes the same point by noticing that what Van Quine calls the idea was presupposed from Descartes' day until the early 18th century. Various philosophers, though, have held on to it, at least until the late 20th century. Ordinary people, and many philosophers before and after Descartes, thought, and still do think, of perception as involving three terms: the perceiver, the object perceived, and the act of perceiving. But inside-out philosophers insert a fourth: the mental idea or impression, or a sense datum, or whatever it might be called. This produces a peculiar sort of skepticism because no one has been able to provide an acceptable account of how we can know that this internal mental mediator accurately reflects what is out there, or even whether there's anything out there at all. When I was in my first term at UC Berkeley, I enrolled in a course which was devoted entirely to convoluted arguments by which the professor was still attempting to account for the possibility of knowing objects in the world on the basis of sense data. So I will end this already too long aside on Hume by expressing the hope that after hearing Tyler's first presentation, specifically on the metaphysical differences between Humean, that is, descriptive laws, and non-Humean governing laws, I will not afterwards have to confess to misrepresentations in what I've just said here. We have an expression where I grew up for having to admit that you're wrong. It's called eating crow. I don't know what it has to do with the poor birds, but I think it's a funny way to end this section. Now, I think I must be close to the end of my time. Yes. I think a summary is more useful. So here are my main points. Rather than begin in the modern period, I started back in the Middle Ages when, for example, in Granada, Spain, there had been Muslim, Jewish, and Christians over perhaps a century in trialogue. One fun detail, I saw a mosque there that was so huge that it had room inside for an entire Christian cathedral. But although, for instance, Averroism lived on in Europe, it was thought to be theologically inappropriate for Christians because it was taken to lack an account of the survival of an individual rational soul. Then, in my presentation, I got to the real topic, the origin and development of concepts of laws of nature in early modern Western thought. The important point was that the laws of nature were a divine gift. From Descartes, and I'll number these developments. 1, originally mathematization was thought to be a necessary feature of the laws, and 2, by Newton's day, only 3 disciplines were shown to qualify: optics, astronomy, and the laws of motion. After much controversy, it was agreed that God had created mathematics just as he had the laws themselves. 3, Boyle added the non-mathematical science of chemistry, so this was the beginning of the expansion of the range of scientific disciplines. Boyle also added, on the basis of voluntarist theology, number 4, the necessity of empirical discovery of the laws, and 5, the concept of precise reports of his experimental procedures. I turned then to some historians of science. 6, from Gauck-Rogers' concept of providential deism to 7, formalization of the legal mechanical concept of science that lasted for centuries. 8, Boyle based the inviolability of the laws on God's omniscience. I hope you all could read those things because I'm going through them really quickly. 9, the uniformity of nature became an apologetic argument for God's existence. I then gave, as an example of Boyle's thought, a description of his objection to a strange movement called spiritualism. From historian Ben Lunteren, I included 10, the claim that the search for laws became the central business of science. However, 11, both Boyle and Thomas Reid questioned whether matter could literally obey laws and noted that the word law must be a mere metaphor that it was originally meant to be. I added 12, that for centuries the concept of explanation has been associated with the empirical discovery of laws, and related, 13, there is the ongoing question of whether the laws of nature, here in scare quotes, are necessary or contingent. Finally, 14, I suggested that interpretations of scholars such as Hume vary along with the acceptance or rejection of the existence and need for an internal mental entity, such as an impression or today a sense datum. Well, that's it for now. Be sure to tune in to Tyler's presentations, related presentations on Tuesday. And just after that, I'll be on again. But advance warning, I'm going to twist the proposed title that's in the program. In the program, it says, "Can the laws of nature survive the death of God?" To nearly the opposite, how the laws of nature have led for many to the death of God. Now it's time to stop for questions, but I want to remind you that I'd really prefer that this be discussion time, because I'm sure that there are people listening in the audience who know more about these issues than I do. So I just thank you for your attention.